Visit grizzly.com for our full line of planers.
Microjig, maker of the gripper. Work safer, work smarter.
The mortise and tenon joint is an incredibly popular woodworking joint, and it's for good reason. It's incredibly strong. But what some of you guys might not realize is that there are two different types of tenons that you could use for your woodworking. There's the more traditional integral tenon, where the tenon and the stock are from the same piece of wood. And there is the floating tenon variety, where the actual tenon material is made from a separate piece of wood. When using your common yellow woodworking glues, there's no difference in strength between an integral mortise and tenon joint and a floating mortise and tenon joint, but the method for making them is a little bit different. Probably the trickiest part of using floating tenon joinery is making all of your end grain mortises. But back in 2009, I made a fixture for myself which enabled me to make all of these end grain mortises, and I have the plans available if you want them for a small fee, and I also have a build video that you could watch which is free. In this video, I didn't want to just rehash all of the features of this fixture that I've shown in a previous video, but I did want to introduce it to those of you that might not be familiar with it, and I wanted to introduce a new twist on floating tenon joinery that you can do with this fixture that I didn't show in the other video. The twist that I wanted to show you guys that you can do with this fixture and floating tenons is to make double floating tenons. Now this comes in real handy in certain situations in furniture building, and it's really easy to do with this fixture. I've already laid out for the two mortises that we need to make for the floating tenons, and this is the region that we need to remove with the router and the fixture. I have an edge guide on my plunge router, and I've lined up my router bit over the mortise location that's furthest away from the edge guide. With my two positive stops, I can set the length of the mortise. With the router bit bottomed out on the workpiece, I can use a brass setup bar and my turret stop to set the depth of the mortise. Those settings for both the depth of the mortise and the length of the mortise only need to be done once, and then you can batch out all of your pieces. In order to create the second mortise for our double floating tenon, I made a shim at the table saw that's the right thickness, which I'll put in between the fixture and the plunge router fence, and that'll push the router bit back far enough or the right amount so that the router bit lines up with our mark that we made for the second mortise. It's very important that with the edge guide to the left, as you're making this cut, that you pull the router towards you. That way, as the router bit is making its cut, it will act by pulling the edge guide into the fixture instead of in the other direction. I'm going to make the mating mortises for our loose tenon joinery in a piece of scrap wood, and I marked out the location of both mortises. And I'm also going to use the same shim again that we used at the fixture earlier. But technically, you really only need to mark out the location of one of the mortises, and the shim will take care of the second one automatically. Now for the second mating mortise, I'm going to use that same shim again. Now all that's left to do to complete this floating tenon joinery is to make the loose tenon stock. Now for that I'm going to use a piece of scrap cherry, and sometimes people will ask me is it really necessary to use the same species of wood for the tenon material that you have for your stock. And I really don't think it makes that big a deal as long as you don't use a wood for the tenon material that's really oily. but I usually stick with the same species. I like to get my tenon material close to the required thickness using the planer, and then at the drum sander I take it the rest of the way. Because the router bit leaves rounded edges on the ends of the mortises, we need to round over the edges of the loose tenon stock. And I'll do that with an 1/8 inch radius roundover bit at the router table. In my opinion, the best way to cut loose tenon stock to size is by using a small table saw sled and a pencil eraser. So that's it, guys. Double floating tenons using a plunge router, an edge guide, and my mortising fixture and a shim. And yeah, just in case it's not obvious, you can also use this same mortising fixture to make single floating tenons as well. Thanks for watching, guys.